Hey everybody, it's Alex Miller at Capnion here. I speak to you today as a reformed calculus teacher, and my message for you is to be a little bit wary of teaching to the test. What do I mean by this? I see a lot of news, exciting news about this or that new large language model and how well it did on this or that test. And I don't mean to diminish that too much. There is exciting progress being made, but a lot of these tests, there's a lot known about them and what they are like. And you have to consider if the LLM is to some degree getting good at that particular test and not really good at the flexible intelligence some humans at least have that people are implicitly suggesting based on those good performances on that test. So let me return to being a calculus teacher for a second. It was at least my experience, there's a whole lot of daylight between teaching people calculus and teaching people to do well on a particular calculus test. A really silly extreme example is if you tell people all the questions and all the answers in advance, you've done a really good job helping them get ready for that test. You really haven't taught them any calculus. And it's slippery, but there's a lot of fuzziness and in the middle space between just teaching somebody calculus and just giving somebody the answers. I think you might be surprised how much it can be true that somebody can sit down and take a test, and by a sort of, okay, when I see this question, I write this answer, do well on that test. And if you had some kind of broader conversation with them about calculus, they did well on the test, but somehow they have absolutely no idea what's going on. And we should be wary here, returning to LLMs. In some ways, a large language model under the hood is a super high-powered autocomplete. And exactly what it is doing is, okay, if there's this question, what goes after it in the answer box? The following thing goes after it. So there's some danger of this. And I want to talk about some general things in machine learning that I think are a little bit surprising to review relative to some discourse about large language models. I hope the technical crowd out there is all familiar with them. They're fairly foundational. So people like to talk about this or that large language model having so many parameters, which is to say there's so much information in the structure of the model, and to talk about this as a good thing. In a lot of contexts in machine learning more broadly, to have a more complex model is bad. And the reason that it's bad is that it is just memorizing things, whereas it doesn't really capture any more fundamental signal that's in the data. And the problem with memorizing things is that when you try to have that model operate on some data that doesn't look something like the stuff it's memorized, it's going to do something really spastic and weird. And it tends to be true for lots of classes of machine learning models that the more structure you have, the more spastic and weird the model is going to get when you try to put in some data that wasn't explicitly in the data that was used to train it. In the LLM case, if we're talking about wanting the LLM to be a knowledge base, to answer questions about facts and this kind of thing, and I would note somehow we talk a whole lot about that, even though I don't think that's a great practice right now, and it might never be that great a practice. To the extent we want to talk about the LLM's going to give us knowledge, it's like, okay, well, great. Maybe it's okay that it memorizes things. But if we get really excited about these tests, we should look at the tests and say, you could take a zillion of these old tests, especially if they're something that predates LLM and AI. And there's a lot of old examples sitting on the web somewhere. Math competition tests, for example. An LLM with a huge number of parameters definitely has the potential to essentially memorize mountains and mountains of old tests, in a sense. And if you give it a new test and the questions on that new test are resembling the old ones, and often questions get recycled, there's a lot of potential that the LLM is going to do well on that because it's essentially memorized the answer. Not only does this not necessarily mean it's going to do well on similar tasks when you give it something that's pretty different than what it's seen before, but it's very possible, especially if you have many, many, many parameters, it's actually going to do something really weird. And one of the big stumbling blocks for businesses to use large language models in this knowledge-based context is the hallucination problem. I'm implicitly talking here about the hallucination problem being extra weird and nasty and bad. So to recap, I'm sure progress is being made. That's great. It's probably real in some sense, and maybe someday you can use your LLM as a knowledge base. If you look at some commonplace tests that a lot of humans take, and which there are many examples from back in the day floating around, and your large language model got some kind of score on it, it is not safe to presume that LLM is going to be generally as smart or intellectually flexible or solve problems as well as a human that gave that performance on that test with the same test got the same score. And exactly because the LLM has a lane to cheat and memorize the test and the human doesn't. And then once again, this massive memorization problem, you should worry a little bit that if it's out there, it's going to make the hallucination problem worse once you get off one of these standard cant tests. So be careful out there. It's a very nuanced, philosophically complicated, controversial topic to compare AI or large language models specifically to human intelligence. And I think this is one example where you need to give humans a little bit of a handicap because there are interesting ways in which the large language model is maybe probably cheating and doing a toxic, prototoxic thing that might not be what you